out of your organization and involve other partners, and when there's that link, it can be hacked. You know, when it comes to risk, it seems like every year is the most challenging year ever. That's what companies always say. But on the other hand, I hear that 2017 was especially challenging, and I'm wondering if that's the case with you guys. Irvin, do you feel like your clients are telling you that it was an especially difficult year when it came to risk?
They were, and they certainly noticed a lot of very difficult things, not necessarily to themselves, but to others. And in fact, we had really three areas that was as difficult as any that we've experienced this past year. One was in cybersecurity. We thought we had heard the last of companies who were being hacked for information, and that we thought that companies had resolved those issues, only for us to learn that Equifax, a major credit agency, was hacked and millions of identities were known. Who would have thought that that could still happen? But it did. We also had more than our share of natural disasters. In fact, we hadn't had very many disasters for a while. It seemed like very quiet, like hurricanes weren't as difficult as before, and suddenly we're here with 4 powerful hurricanes, including Hurricane Maria and the devastation it brought to Puerto Rico. Not only the tremendous infrastructure damage, but the realization that the U.S. pharmaceutical industry, which had concentrated a lot of production in Puerto Rico, to such a point where they made products, certain products only in Puerto Rico, like IV bags that hospitals need. Suddenly we had an IV bag shortage. So how was it that they were able to maximize and optimize the supply chains by going to a location like that which produces good quality? They have various tax incentives, but at the same time they put all their eggs in that one basket. That was something that we all had to learn from. The third part was we all have been going along our steady pace of globalization, new trade pacts, and what happened this year? Now, does any company in the U.S. know whether or not they're going to be having favorable or unfavorable trade with other countries? What is that going to do to all the decisions that were made years ago expecting to have that continuity? So I think those three together really was an exceptionally difficult year.
Wow, that is 3 pretty serious challenges. Now in pharma and biotech, both you guys are in that. Did you echo what Irvin is saying? Do you get the same thing in your global supply chain? I mean, your stuff is so important, you know, the rare disease treatment. Is the same thing in your area?
I would definitely agree with what Irvin's saying, and I actually would bring it one more level up, which is for cybersecurity is the impact even to the supply chain and the providers of the supply chain. So we had an incident where the ocean carrier, they were hacked and they couldn't berth at the port. And a lot of our product is 2 to 8 temperature controlled, and is, as much as we like to handle and manage the temperature of those containers and put all security measures, if it's on the boat, there's less access to that container. It's putting higher risk to our product. So that had a huge impact to us and ensuring that we can continue the supply to the patient. Puerto Rico as well, the second, third tier visibility of our supplier, that definitely was a big highlight for us. Is okay, we knew our suppliers were managing the situation and we got communication from them, but then the suppliers, if they were having issues with that communication chain, it also had a downstream impact to us.
Yeah, and I'll dovetail into that. I mean, exactly. For us, 2017 started out as a year where we were going to map, monitor, and then proactively take measures to start putting mitigation in place, running what-if scenarios ahead of time. And the 4 major hurricanes that came along with the Mexico City earthquake pushed us to move faster than what we had originally planned to do that, right? And fortunately, we were in a position from a data perspective that we were able to utilize tools that we have to proactively mitigate risk. So, for Puerto Rico, for example, we knew several days, obviously, beforehand that there was going to be a hurricane come across the island. To what level of devastation, we had no idea. But what we were able to do is, through some of our technology tools, run what-if scenarios and identify key suppliers, sub-tier suppliers especially, what components we had being manufactured on the island. At Biogen, we don't manufacture on the island of Puerto Rico, but we have suppliers that do, right? So having that visibility and being able to proactively make decisions around risk before the impact even occurred was very significant to us.
Yeah, was that your experience, your clients, Matt? Were they able to get through the year with technology tools, or were there some challenges that you guys saw them facing as well?
I mean, I think everybody has gotten through the year. I would say that that people have done it with various levels of aplomb. So, I mean, we see a lot of companies that, we see a lot of companies like Shire and Biogen who, are maturing in their risk management processes, and they're like, what can I do next? Should I look at supplier business continuity? Should I look at cybersecurity? And then you have the other end of the spectrum where see a lot of clients who see their suppliers doing things in supply chain risk, and they see their customers doing things in supply chain risk, and they're not really sure where to start, right? So we're trying to offer solutions to kind of both ends of the spectrum to allow companies to address some of these new and emerging risks, as well as build a program from the ground up to make sure that when Maria happens again next year or the following year, that they weather it like some of our better in class customers.
Yeah, the cyber aspect of it, it's interesting what you said, Irvin. You said that companies thought that they had the cyber problem licked, and I'm not sure that I know too many companies that actually ever really said that they felt that they had. Were they really, you think, complacent about cyber threats, and then suddenly had to have a new realization based on the latest series of hacks?
Well, I'm not an expert in that area, but to me, I think they were complacent. I think that whether a department store like a Target got hit, we found out how they did it. Was fairly easy to do, and so companies took corrective measures against that. But the good guys were not catching up with the bad guys. So each time we found a solution, the bad guys came up with other solutions. How would it be that Equifax, with all those records, had not figured out a way to prevent someone from coming in there? And not only that, it had taken them quite a while to be able to realize that they had been hacked. So I think we're not keeping up with it. We had a great presentation at this conference from the National Institute of Standards on cybersecurity, and they had tremendous amount of information, framework for all the security, but uncertain as to how many companies are actually aware of such a framework. How many companies are actively actually promoting that kind of security?
Yeah, I like to say there's a lot of efficiency and ignorance, right? So, especially in the risk management world. So, I mean, we're seeing, when you talk about not knowing where to start, cybersecurity is one of those things that, frankly, supply chain procurement people, they don't even know how to touch. They know it impacts them, and they know they have a role in that, but nobody really knows what the role is. So it'll be really interesting to see how that evolves over time.
Is cyber a big issue in biotech and pharma? I mean, and if so, what are they after when they go after you guys?
Well, yes, I mean, I'm not an expert in cybersecurity either, but from what I understand, internally in our own organization, a lot of time what happens is yes, cyber is a big security concern. A lot of it's phishing, trying to obtain information. One of the biggest concerns in the pharma industry is clinical data, right? So clinical data for when you're running clinical trials for the next products coming to market. I mean, that's very controlled, sealed data that needs to remain that way. So, obviously if a bad actor could get their hands on that kind of data, there's plenty of other nefarious actors that would buy it from them, right, to do all sorts of things with. So, you can leave it to your imagination to think about what some of those could be. But yeah, definitely a big concern in the pharmaceutical space for cybersecurity, not only our own data, but our patient data as well, for things.
And the challenge with cybersecurity as well is, I mean, as you guys know, like the really talented cyber criminals, you'll never even know they're there, right? So it's the breaches that aren't caught. And that's really where kind of the management systems approach comes in is, how can we make sure that we have the safeguards in place, that we hold our suppliers accountable to what's happening within their organization so that those breaches they don't catch aren't actually happening.
Well, I guess the positive side of it is that there are lessons to be learned from these mistakes and these drawbacks. I mean, Mika, you must learn these lessons all the time.
I think we'll continue to learn. They mentioned it today as we create more and more innovative solutions to service the patients or to service the customers. There's more platforms and technology being utilized. There's more entryways into our systems. So, for example, we're looking ways of how can patients get better access to their treatments. And they have to look up the information on their phone. So then that's another entryway where people can get information about the patient or get a link back into the company. And so we have to be aware of, as we create new tools and new solutions, how are we going to de-risk the impact to the company as well?
Wow, so many weak points.
And also if you look at it from a supply chain side as well, right? I mean, what happens when one of your suppliers is hacked, right? Or somebody that you purchase components from or things like that. I mean, just the ripple down effect alone of that could be as catastrophic or more so than even a hurricane in Puerto Rico, right? I mean, to the flow of goods.
And in fact, that is the most likely way that you get hacked. It's not that the company, someone comes at you directly, not even necessarily as a first tier, but that second or third tier. And so companies are realizing while they had various supplier requirements, they really weren't, they could say, well, we don't know really about the second or third tier. Well, if you don't know it, that's where in fact the bad guys are going to be able to come in. But I should also say, this whole area of information, it is cyber that's enabling organizations to be much more efficient. The sharing of information among suppliers, among customers, that is what's motivating us. That allows us to become more efficient. That allows us to reduce our logistics footprint. The same tool that's enabling us to work better and more efficiently is also a tool that's making us more vulnerable. So when we talk about, and Matt's point was also well taken about supply chain managers are judged and evaluated based on how well and how efficient the supply chains are they're working. Are they judged and evaluated on how well they've been able to minimize the vulnerability? If they are not, then they're doing their job, which is to optimize supply chains. So who's actually the one trying to minimize the vulnerability? And that turns out to be, I think, at times a rather black hole in organizations.
The moment you set foot out of your organization and involve other partners, that there's that link that can be hacked. You have to be careful about that. The other thing that I found, I've been talking to some of you folks today about your various supply chains, and this notion of sole sourcing, of single sourcing. The common wisdom is, well, don't do it. Diversify your suppliers. If a tsunami hits Japan, you've got a supplier over in Poland or something. But what you folks have been telling me is that that's not always possible. I mean, is it the case, like in biotech and pharma, that you just simply have to live with a sole source situation and then deal accordingly with the risk of that? Is that your impression?
I don't think it's that we have to live with it. It's just there are certain regulatory and quality related constraints. So it takes time. And I think that's where you just have to, there's two components. One is the reactive side. So you have sole source or customized solutions. So you have to prioritize what you're going to tackle and understand what the long range plan is. But then there's the front end of it, which we're starting to get into, is as people are developing products, as R&D is going through the process of selecting how a product is made, the material, how do we get the right people involved early on in telling them, hey, do you have to have this customized solution? Do you have to have this? Is there any other alternative material that you could use? And really having that honest discussion earlier on in the R&D clinical trial stages.
But is the answer sometimes yes? Are there options, or is it just a question of, I'm
sometimes
sorry that this particular substance or product has to be built with that supplier, with that supply from that supplier?
Sometimes, so far, there's been maybe a small handful of material where we see it might be a mineral that's only sourced from this one part of the world. Literally, geographically and component-wise, you're restricted. Nowhere else in the world do they have this mineral. And so we can't find an alternative, so we have to work to find a backup solution if something happens or if there's a shortage. So yeah, there are some cases.
Yeah, I think, I was going to say, I think in some situations, though, I think we find that we're sole sourced or single sourced at the sub-tier level, right? So in other words, by not having data, which now is coming to light because of analytics, et cetera, and the ability to map supply chains to the sub-tier levels and collect the data, you gain visibility to where that sole source is. So it may not be your tier 1 that you're purchasing from that's a sole source. It may be your tier 2 or tier 3. You could look at your tier 1 and say, you know what, we have 6 distributors we buy this certain component from. Well, when you get back to tier 2 or tier 3, you may find out that
they all come from the same
one
place.
source. Correct.
And so you find out, you're surprised to find out.
Yes, absolutely. So fortunately, the tools that we're using today and the data that's available, that that's being shared, is helping us see that more brightly, and then be able to take mitigation against it, and more importantly, think about our pipeline products and what are we going to do with them to not put ourselves in maybe that same situation.
It's an organizational issue, an organizational challenge. If those who are in R&D are tasked with developing, inventing the products that are going to be most efficient, that's what they're going to do. If they're not tasked with also assessing and balancing the risk of the production, then they're not going to consider it. Well, organizations, the corporate suite has to say, if in terms of developing these products, we want you to develop the best possible. However, we want you to balance it off with the risk, which may mean instead of having 100% of a solution that the engineers want to do, maybe they'll say, all right, we can come up with 98% of what you need and cover 98% and have a risk of, let's say, 5%, or we can do all 100% that you want and have a 50% risk. If they're not measuring the risk, then they're going to go for 100%. Department of Defense does this, have all these weapons platforms because they want 100%, because they neglect to look at, well, what if the risk is such that the 100% doesn't happen anyway? If you're not evaluating it. So I say it's an organizational problem, an organizational challenge, and if you don't address that, such as tools that RESLNC has, then I think people are not going to be able to measure why they should change.
Yeah, I mean one question I would have for you guys is, because management systems become so important in a single sole source environment, and in my experience in the high tech industry, we actually use multi-sourcing as a leverage point, right? So if you don't play, then the other person has to. So what kinds of things do you guys, what kind of techniques do you use to drive accountability into those single sole source companies to make sure that they're doing the right things and protecting your bottom line and your patients?
So for us, a lot of it has to do more on understanding what that relationship is with the supplier. So if they understand that, hey, you're a strategic partner, you have an impact to our overall operation, the conversation's a little different. You can't have a like, hey, we're the customer and you're the supplier and it's all your responsibility. You have to have that dialogue of really being transparent and understanding how do you fit in their overall vision, their overall program, and how do they fit in? How do you work together to resolve this issue? What's the give and take between both parties? You can't do it one-sided.
Yeah, I think traditionally the answer always was inventory, right? If you're sole sourced, just build a ton of inventory and carry that inventory, and that minimizes your risk.
But that has a shelf life in your business.
In some cases, yes, absolutely. I think moving forward, as global pressure continues to mount around, healthcare costs, et cetera, one of the big drivers for a lot of the industry is going to be reducing inventory at all stages of manufacturing, right? Whether it's API all the way to finished goods. Yeah. And to do that, having visibility, again, to where you're sole sourced, and then as Mika said, making those trade-offs and the right decisions to work with your partners becomes, more critical and more important than just building, inventory as a solution.
But this also then addresses another question. It's an organizational question. So yes, you could have a strategy of greater inventory, which could help doing that. But then you have a cost situation, cost of obsolescence and so forth. The question we have to ask is, all the measures that any organization takes to become more risk resilient and be able to protect them, to what degree do their customers value that? If the customers value that because it's going to be reliability, consistency, and I'm willing to pay for that, then you can in fact pay for all the measures. But what if the customer says, that's your job, I'm not going to pay extra for it? Now your organization has to ask us, do I take these measures? Because if I don't, I could have a rupture in my supply chain, or do I just hope for the best and do nothing? Because if the customer doesn't put value in it, why should we? How do you answer that kind of question in an organization?
Well, the customer could be doing two things. He could be saying, no, I'm not going to pay for it, but I expect it anyway. I mean, we were all talking about the spoiled consumer in consumer goods these days, but maybe the same thing happens at the higher levels of pharma and biotech, I don't know. But then it's up to you to deliver to that customer or lose that customer. So I also think it's interesting, Irvin, you talk about this idea of balancing. You might be a situation where you're never going to be 100% risk-free. There's always going to be unusual things. And so I guess then it becomes a question of, do you put the emphasis on prevention, or do you put the emphasis on response and reacting to the bad things that are going to happen no matter what you do? And what do you folks do and your clients? I mean, how do you balance those two things?
I think it has to be both. I think
I was afraid you were going to say.
There's no, it's not magic, right? So there's no. We believe that the mature organizations move from let's optimize our response at the very beginning to becoming much more proactive and resilient. And we actually believe in more of a peril agnostic approach, where you're looking at, okay, not just is a hurricane coming, or is a storm coming, or is an earthquake coming, but what happens if I lose this site? What happens if the goods can't get out of this site and go to this site? What if the airport shut down? So looking at the impacts as opposed to the specific perils, but there is a role for peril specific actions as well.
Well, I think as you move more to that proactive state as well, right? And you're running more of the what if scenarios from a strategic perspective to help decide what you're going to do. We got to keep in mind also that as part of that balancing act you're talking about, the threat's constantly changing as well, right? Whatever that threat may be, the only consistent is that change. So we've got to always continue to evaluate and reevaluate and look at what the risk is and what's going on in the global marketplace and in the world as a whole to try to evaluate. Because as Irvin said earlier, criminals are always going to try to be one step ahead of you, no matter what they're trying to do, right? So in certain risks, you got to take that mitigation concept as well.
So 2018, the most challenging year ever, right? Are we doing anything different this year? What do you think, Mika? What do you?
We're definitely doing a lot of things differently. So in our company, we have a multi-year program. So we have a 5-year roadmap on how do we become a robust risk company, mitigating company. And so this year we're implementing some infrastructures around governance. So we have not only from a supply chain perspective, we have procurement, engineering, R&D, product development. We have now a roundtable where organization-wide we have a single platform to talk about risk, align on definitions, align on priorities, and align on how do we report this out throughout the organization so people have visibility and know, hey, we are working on something. Don't think that we don't think risk is important. We are prioritizing it. Hey, I know you're aware of this event, but right now in the list of priorities, it's around here because these are bigger impacts to the company or bigger impacts to the patient.
So I guess the awareness is there, at least at this table. Let's hope that extends to the industry at large.